Imagine setting a record that no player in your league's entire history has ever touched, and nobody notices. Not the broadcast, not the analysts, not even the highlights reel. The cameras were too busy chasing a shove, a clap, and 2 ejections to stop and acknowledge that something genuinely historic had just happened on the same floor, in the same quarter, by the same player everyone claimed they tuned in to watch. That is exactly what happened on June 22nd, when the Indiana Fever hosted the Phoenix Mercury in a game that should have been remembered for one thing and ended up being remembered for something else entirely. 6 technical fouls, 2 ejections, a clapping incident that became a national conversation, and buried underneath all of it, a streak that no one in WNBA history had ever put together before. Caitlin Clark set a league record that night while simultaneously earning her 5th technical foul of the season, watching a teammate get thrown out in her defense, and then standing at the post-game podium choosing to talk about a whistle instead of a milestone. To understand why she made that choice, you have to understand everything that led up to it, because the clap was never really about the clap. Phoenix came into this matchup with something to prove and an early performance that suggested they might actually do it. The Mercury built an advantage that at one point stretched to 16 points, a margin wide enough that most teams would have quietly accepted the deficit and started thinking about the next game on the schedule. Indiana was not most teams. The Fever spent 3 quarters clawing their way back into a contest that had started to look completely out of reach. The shift happened in the 3rd quarter in a way that was difficult to ignore even if you weren't paying close attention to the score. Indiana outscored Phoenix 30-11 in that single period, 30 points to 11 in 1 quarter. That is not a comeback, that is a dismantling. And it happened methodically, possession by possession, without the kind of dramatic single moment that typically anchors a highlight package. Stephanie White's group simply refused to let the game stay decided, and by the time the 4th quarter arrived, the Fever had not only erased a 16-point hole, but had flipped the entire energy of the building. What that 3rd quarter also did, without anyone fully realizing it in the moment, was set the table for everything that followed. Both benches had been watching a game that looked like a comfortable Phoenix win transform into something much closer. That kind of swing does not leave either locker room feeling settled. Players who were ahead by double digits and then watched it evaporate tend to carry that frustration onto the floor when the 4th quarter starts. And players who fought back from that kind of deficit tend to carry their own version of that same electricity. By the time the 4th quarter tipped off, both teams were running hot before a single whistle had blown. The 16-point comeback deserves that framing on its own terms, independent of everything that followed it. The outcome of this game, Indiana winning 86-77, was functionally determined during that 30-11 3rd quarter stretch, before the technical fouls started stacking up, and before the broadcast had any reason to talk about anything else other than basketball. That matters, because most of the conversation after this game focused entirely on the 4th quarter, as though it had decided something. It didn't. The 3rd quarter decided it. The 4th quarter just made sure everyone was paying attention for a completely different reason. By the time Clark drew her technical foul in the 4th quarter, the game had already become something more than a basketball matchup. The tension building between Indiana and Phoenix had a specific shape to it, and that shape had a name attached to it: Dana Bonner. Bonner had spent parts of the previous season on Indiana's roster before her move to Phoenix, a departure that both sides had described differently in public, with enough ambiguity surrounding the circumstances that the word controversial had attached itself to the situation without much pushback from anyone involved. When Clark and Bonner ended up in a battle for position in the 4th quarter, it was not 2 strangers getting into a heated exchange. It was 2 players who had once shared a locker room getting into one, and that distinction matters for how the officials read what followed.
The 2 exchanged words. Clark clapped. The officials whistled her for a technical foul, recorded as being for clapping and instigating. It was the 5th technical foul of her season. The rulebook does not draw a distinction between a clap and a shove once a referee decides a gesture was meant to provoke. And on this night, the officiating crew read Clark's clap through the lens of the verbal exchange that had immediately preceded it, treating the two moments as part of the same sequence rather than separate incidents. The whistle went Clark's way, regardless of the size of the gesture that actually triggered it. Clark did not receive that call quietly. Speaking to reporters afterward, she made her position clear and direct. She said it was ridiculous. She said she got a technical for clapping. She pushed further, arguing that the call worked against her own situation rather than for it. If any technical should be taken away, she said, it should be that one. She didn't understand it at all. And she went even further than that, pointing out what the accumulation of 5 technicals actually means inside the WNBA's disciplinary structure. She told reporters that everyone should go ahead and pick a game on the calendar now, because at the rate she was being called, a suspension was essentially already scheduled. That last part is where Clark's frustration stopped being about wounded pride over a single bad call and started being about something more structural. The WNBA suspends players automatically once they reach a specific technical foul threshold within a season. Every technical counts toward that number identically, regardless of what generated it. A shove, a shouted argument with an official, a clap during a heated exchange. All of them register the same way once logged. Clark was not at the podium complaining about one whistle. She was at the podium describing a system that treats a clap and a shove as functionally identical entries on the same running list, and pointing out, without saying it quite so directly, that she was getting closer to the threshold with calls that other players were not receiving for similar gestures. The Page-Booker's comparison did not surface accidentally in the coverage that followed. Earlier in the season, the Dallas guard had a technical foul rescinded after a broadly similar clapping incident. The league had apparently been willing in that instance to separate the gesture from any intent to provoke, determining that a clap in the middle of a heated exchange did not automatically constitute instigation. Whether that same standard was applied evenly from one broadcast to the next is a question the league had not publicly addressed by the time this game ended. The comparison doesn't prove inconsistency on its own, but it invites the question regardless, and the absence of any public explanation made the question linger longer than it might have otherwise. Whatever anyone thought about Clark's technical, the sequence that followed it moved fast enough that the broadcast barely had time to keep up with its own camera angles. Sophie Cunningham had already established herself around the league as the kind of player who moves towards this type of confrontation rather than away from it. Her reputation in that regard was not new or surprising to anyone who had watched Indiana play through the season. What was notable was how quickly she stepped into the space between Clark and Bonner after the technical had already been assessed. Cunningham and Bonner got into their own heated exchange. Both were assessed technical fouls. The count for the quarter climbed again. 4 technicals, 4 players, and the fourth quarter still had time on the clock. Less than 10 seconds later, the sequence reached its actual breaking point. Maisha Hines-Allen, still carrying the heat from her own earlier confrontation with Alyssa Thomas, the separate technical foul exchange that had happened earlier in the same quarter, shoved Alyssa Thomas. The contact was clear enough that the officials did not hesitate. A second technical foul on Hines-Allen meant an automatic ejection under the league's rules. She left the court having played 14 minutes, finishing with 3 points, 1 rebound, and 1 assist. A modest statistical line attached to a moment that dominated the broadcast's fourth quarter coverage far more than anything that appeared in the actual box score. Thomas, for her part, did not retaliate. She walked away from the contact rather than escalating it further. It was a calculated response from a player aware that answering in kind would have ended her own night in exactly the same way it had just ended Hines-Allen's. She absorbed the shove, kept walking, and let the officials handle the consequence. That restraint, in its own way, said as much about Thomas's read of the moment as Hines-Allen's shove said of hers.
The broadcast cameras locked onto the confrontation in a way that told its own story. In the seconds after Cunningham's exchange with Bonner, camera operators stayed fixed on the two of them rather than cutting to a wide shot of the court. The image of Cunningham pointing directly at Bonner while the two continued jawing circulated widely online in the days that followed, stripped of its game context and turned into its own separate story about a gesture rather than the sequence of events that had produced it. That is how quickly something from a professional basketball game becomes a social media clip with its own life, its own audience, and its own version of what happened that has nothing to do with the scoreboard. All 6 technical fouls, 2 ejections, an entire fourth quarter of penalties compressed into a sequence that took less than 10 minutes to fully develop and resolve. And underneath all of it, a basketball game Indiana was still trying to close out while its own roster was getting thrown off the court one player at a time. The most important detail about Hines-Allen's ejection is not the shove itself, it is what the shove was responding to. Hines-Allen did not shove Alyssa Thomas over a play that had touched her directly. Her confrontation with Thomas had been building since earlier in the same quarter, fed by the same tension that had produced Clark's exchange with Bonner and Cunningham's exchange that followed it. By the time Hines-Allen made contact, she was not reacting to something Thomas had done to her, she was absorbing a cost on behalf of a dispute that had started with someone else several possessions earlier. That kind of response does not happen by accident on a professional roster. Players do not take ejections for situations that do not directly involve them without some level of shared understanding among teammates about what is and is not acceptable on the floor. Cunningham's technical carried the same signal. Neither of these moments reflected impulsive, out-of-control play from players who had lost track of the situation. Both reflected something more deliberate, a roster that has spent an entire season building a specific pattern around how physical play directed at its point guard gets handled once the whistle goes silent. That pattern did not appear overnight, and it is not limited to the 2 players who drew fouls in this specific game. It describes an entire bench's posture. When contact lands on Clark, or when a confrontation starts building around her, Indiana's roster has developed a consistent answer to it that does not require instructions from the coaching staff in the moment. Hines-Allen and Cunningham were both willing to accept the consequences that night, because the alternative, letting it go unanswered, apparently wasn't something this group considers an option anymore. A team trying to protect a lead in the fourth quarter does not typically welcome losing a rotation player to an ejection that could have been avoided. Indiana absorbed that cost anyway. No visible hesitation from anyone on the bench in the immediate aftermath of Hines-Allen's ejection. No reaction from the coaching staff that suggested this outcome had surprised anyone. The Fever had lost a bench contributor for the remainder of the night and treated it like a line item rather than a crisis. That kind of collective composure, in a situation that specific, does not come from nowhere. What it tells you about where this team is right now is worth sitting with for a moment, separate from whether Hines-Allen should have shoved Alyssa Thomas or whether Cunningham should have stayed out of the Bonner situation. Protecting the best player on your roster is not unusual. Doing it to the point where teammates absorb ejections as an accepted cost of that protection is a different level of collective commitment. And it raises its own question about whether that posture is sustainable across a full season, especially as Clark gets closer to a suspension threshold that every additional technical from any source makes more likely to arrive sooner. Strip away every technical foul from the June 22nd box score, and what remains is one of the cleaner statistical nights of Clark's season. 24 points, 9 assists, 8 of 17 from the field, 29 minutes, 3 rebounds. On a quieter night, in a game that stayed calm, that performance would have been the entire story and probably would have generated its own full broadcast segment with highlights cut specifically around it. The number that outlasts the box score is the streak attached to it. With that performance, Clark extended her consecutive games with at least 20 points and 5 assists to 6 straight. 6 consecutive games. At the Olympic break, she was averaging 17 points and 8 assists per game on the season. The 6-game streak represented the longest such run in WNBA history. No player had ever put together 6 straight games at that combined scoring and playmaking threshold before. That is a record that comes with no asterisk or qualification. It is a clean historical marker in a league that has existed long enough for records like that to carry real weight. Does a record mean less because it happened inside a game mostly remembered for its technical fouls? The honest answer is the opposite. Clark produced that sixth consecutive 25 game while drawing a technical foul, absorbing a hostile fourth quarter that had turned physically confrontational, and watching a teammate get ejected in her defense. Those are not conditions under which statistical production typically improves. Players who get into technical foul situations mid-game watch the dynamic around them escalate to ejections and spend their post-game time at the podium discussing officiating rather than milestones, tend not to have just set league records in the same quarter. Clark did all of that simultaneously without the performance suffering for it. Her post-game comments made the relationship between the record and the frustration explicit. She was not speaking from the losing side of a close game trying to redirect attention from a defeat. Indiana had won. She had set a WNBA record. She chose to spend her time at the podium on the officiating rather than the milestone. Why would a player do that? Because for Clark, the two were never separate conversations. The technical was not an isolated bad call she was willing to let go. It was entry number 5 on a list that was getting uncomfortably close to a threshold with consequences attached to it, and a clap had just added to it the same way a shove would have. She was not performing frustration for the cameras. She was making a calculation about what she was willing to let pass unremarked in public. And a system that treated those two gestures identically apparently wasn't something she was willing to let go quietly. She didn't celebrate the record that night. She talked about the clap instead. And the reason for that choice is actually more revealing about where she is in this season than any stat line could be. The fourth quarter of this game generated enough content to fill a week's worth of sports coverage. What it also did was completely consume the story of how Indiana got to that fourth quarter in a position to win in the first place. And that story deserves its own accounting. Monique Billings finished with 14 points and 10 rebounds, her first double-double of the season. It was a quiet, physical contribution on a night when nearly all of the attention went to confrontations rather than production. And it came at exactly the kind of moment in the season when Indiana needed that kind of output from its front court. Billings had not put together a double-double at any point before that game. The timing of it arriving in a matchup this chaotic against a team Indiana had trailed by 16 at one stage is the kind of detail that disappears from the recap entirely unless someone goes back through the box score specifically looking for it. That is exactly what happened across most of the coverage that followed this game. The story that traveled was the fourth quarter. The story that built the lead Indiana spent the fourth quarter defending, in large part, came from a front court player who has not always been the first name mentioned in Indiana's rotation, suddenly delivering the most complete game of her season. Not every Fever starter had a strong night, and that honesty is part of the full accounting too. Aaliyah Boston finished with 8 points on 2 of 9 shooting, a rough outing by her own standards. She absorbed minutes and defensive assignments without the offensive production that usually accompanies her floor time. One player's off night alongside another player's best game of the season, set against a third player setting a league record, all inside the same 40 minutes. That is the complete version of what Indiana did on June 22nd, and it is a considerably more complicated portrait than the one the fourth quarter produced. The comeback itself, 16 points down, 30-11 in the third quarter, control of the game before the technical fouls started accumulating, was the actual engine of this result. Everything that followed in the fourth quarter was noise layered on top of an outcome that had already been substantially decided. Would this game be remembered differently if the fourth quarter had stayed calm? Almost certainly. The same comeback, the same final score, and a significantly shorter recap. The fourth quarter changed the conversation around the game without changing the result of it. Alyssa Thomas finished with 19 points, 5 rebounds, and 9 assists in a losing effort. Those numbers represent a productive night by any standard in this league. What happened alongside those numbers is the part that got buried almost immediately once the fourth quarter's technical foul sequence took over the broadcast. During that game, Thomas became the fastest player in WNBA history to reach 500 career assists with one franchise. She surpassed the pace Clark herself had set, doing it in 4 fewer games.
It's a genuine marker of a long, productive career built on a passing rate sustained across hundreds of games, not something specific to this one night. It represents exactly the kind of consistent, durable excellence that careers get measured against once the highlight-chasing moments fade.
Kyla Copper added 20 points for the Mercury. Neither Phoenix's best individual performances were enough to overcome the deficit Indiana had built in the third quarter, and neither drew anywhere near the attention the fourth quarter confrontations generated once the broadcast moved away from the box score. Thomas's milestone, in particular, deserved its own segment and did not get one. The moment the fourth quarter turned confrontational, the broadcast's priorities reorganized entirely, and everything that had happened before it, including a legitimate piece of WNBA history from a player on the losing team, got folded into the background. None of Thomas's individual achievement that night was connected to the technical foul she picked up later in the same quarter. The milestone and the foul were two separate things that happened to share a game. The broadcast treated them as one story because it was easier than separating them once the fourth quarter gave everyone a more immediately dramatic story to follow. The near-total silence on Thomas's assist milestone once the confrontation started says more about what audiences respond to than about which achievement actually carried more weight historically. Phoenix fell to 5 wins and 13 losses with the defeat, their 5th loss in 6 games. Those are numbers that reflect a team working through a difficult stretch of a season, not a one-game problem. Indiana improved to 10 wins and 7 losses, snapping a 2-game skid that had preceded this Mercury series. Neither record shifted dramatically because of a single game's result. But the manner of this win, a 16-point comeback capped by a fourth quarter nobody fully controlled, left a longer impression on both rosters than 2 digits in a win-loss column would suggest on their own. Thomas's physical history with Clark did not begin on June 22nd, and it did not end there. The two have been on opposite ends of physical, closely officiated sequences across multiple seasons. Every time these two specific players end up in the same frame during a nationally broadcast game, it generates a volume of commentary that goes well beyond what 2 players from different teams usually produce in a regular season matchup. This game added one more entry to a pattern that had already drawn significant attention from fans and analysts well before this particular matchup was on the calendar. Why does one player's name keep surfacing in these situations more than any other opponent Clark faces? Part of the answer is structural. Thomas plays a physical, contact-heavy style that generates friction with guards regardless of who they are. Part of it is scheduling. Indiana and Phoenix meet repeatedly on nationally broadcast slates, which means their individual matchups accumulate in the public record in ways that quieter divisional pairings don't. 2 closely watched teams meeting this often, with this much attention already on both of their best players, was always going to produce more flashpoints than a similar matchup buried on a weeknight slate that nobody outside the 2 markets was watching. The broader context extends well past this single divisional pairing. Physical play directed at Clark has been a recurring subject across her entire time in the league, discussed by teammates, opposing coaches, and national media in terms that go well beyond any one opponent or any one game. What June 22nd added to that ongoing conversation was not a new complaint. It was a visible, on-camera example of how Indiana's roster has started answering it in real time. Not through statements to reporters, not through post-game quotes about needing protection, through what Hines-Allen and Cunningham were both willing to risk on the floor when it mattered, in front of a national broadcast audience, with the game still in the balance.
That shift in how Indiana responds to physical play around Clark is the most significant development this game actually revealed. More significant than the technical foul count, more significant than the ejection, and arguably more significant than the record, even though the record is the thing that history will carry. A star player being targeted is a story as old as professional basketball. A roster building a collective posture around answering that targeting is something different, and it is something this Indiana group has been quietly constructing across an entire season without making a formal announcement about it. None of what happened on June 22nd resolved anything. The 5 technical fouls stand on Clark's record exactly as they were logged, regardless of how defensible any individual one was or wasn't. The officiating debate that the clapping technical reignited did not produce any public clarification from the league. The comparison to Booker's rescinded technical remained an open question. The physical pattern between Clark and Thomas remained an open pattern, and the Indiana versus Phoenix rematch was already on the schedule before this game ended, which meant every storyline the night generated was guaranteed an audience primed to watch for a repeat before either roster had time to move past what had just happened. What the game did leave behind, cleanly and without ambiguity, are 2 records on the same stat sheet. Clark's 6 consecutive 20-point and 5 assists, a WNBA first. Thomas's 500 career assists with one franchise, achieved faster than anyone in league history. 2 milestones, 1 game. 1 remembered by almost everyone who watched it. 1 remembered by almost no one. The record for consecutive 25 games does not carry an asterisk for the technical fouls that surrounded it. Nothing about the technical foul total changes what Clark actually did on the floor across those 29 minutes. Both facts are true at the same time, on the same stat line, the record and the frustration, and neither one cancels the other out, regardless of which side of the officiating debate a viewer lands on. What she did on June 22nd will be in the books long after the specific details of the fourth quarter confrontations have blurred in everyone's memory. The clap will eventually become a footnote. The record will remain. 6 straight games of 20 points and 5 assists, first in league history, set while earning a technical foul, watching a teammate get ejected, and then choosing to spend her post-game podium time talking about a whistle instead of a milestone. She didn't celebrate the record, she fought the call, because to her, walking away from the officiating question silently would have been its own kind of answer, one she apparently wasn't willing to give. Indiana got the win. Clark got the record. Cunningham made sure nobody forgot who had her back. And somewhere in the noise of 6 technical fouls and 2 ejections, a piece of WNBA history happened that the broadcast almost entirely missed. That's the version of June 22nd that actually holds up. Everything else was just the fourth quarter.